long days, pleasant nights, and welcome to Kingslingers, a Doof Media podcast journeying through Stephen King's Dark Tower series and beyond. I'm your host, constant reader Scott Daly, and I'm joined by my co-host and King newbie, Mr. Matt Freeman. Matt, what you got there?
It's my innocence. I found it.
Oh, neat. Well, what's it look like?
It's like small and yellow, and it's kind of soft and squishy.
Are you actually leaning towards an object that I'm supposed to be recognizing at this point? Because I thought I was gonna go tennis ball, and then I didn't know. You lost me with squishy.
Makes a little squeaky sound when you squeeze it. It has like a little.
Is it a rubber ducky?
It's a rubber ducky.
Your innocence is a rubber ducky.
Yeah.
Jesus.
Good job, by the way.
This week on the show, we're going to be taking one final look at Stephen King's novella, Low Men in Yellow Coats, before we move on with our season 2 journey. But we just wanted to have a quick overview episode. This is going to be a little bit different episode for us, Matt, because this was only a 3-episode book. It was a shorter story, so probably didn't need this episode, but I still like these. Just look at the book as a whole episode. Just look back at the themes, really kind of nail our finish, because I think in the final episode we always get so wrapped up in the ending specifically and all the things that happen in those final pages, we don't get to take a step back. So we're going to take a step back, and I think we're going to kind of let our listeners kind of control the flow of this conversation. We asked people last week what were their overall thoughts on Low Men in Yellow Coats, and if there was anything they wanted us to talk about or they wanted to talk about. And so we kind of shaped the conversation, or the frame of the conversation, around the responses we got. So a little bit different from normal, but it's going to be fun.
Yeah, I agree.
Before we get into it, Matt, we got a couple quick announcements. Do you want to talk about Do the King thing?
Yeah. So as you probably noticed, we pushed onto the feed this week the Do the King Thing bonus episode, where we were joined by the hosts of the Do the Right Thing podcast, Alexandra and Jarvis, and they basically helped us talk about the 3 winning submissions for the Do the King Thing contest, and then we also read those submissions out in our best audiobook reading voices, and it was a fun discussion. It's always fun to read things out loud in general. Mm-hmm. And the stories were great. So if you haven't read the stories, or even if you have read the stories, then maybe go check the episode out and listen to them, and appreciate everyone's artistic creations. Yeah,
I mean, I think if this thing popped up in your feed a couple days ago and you're like, what the hell is this? I'm not listening to this. This is just our way of saying, no, listen to it. The stories are fantastic. We had a lot of fun talking about them. And this is kind of the end result of our very longer than we thought process on the Do the King Thing contest. So check that out. 3 great stories, a bunch of other great stories. There's a link in the episode show notes that links back to our website that has every single story that was submitted. So you can read them all and enjoy them all, and celebrate the winners.
That's right.
All right. One other quick announcement. Our Patreon exclusive bonus podcast that we do once a month related to Kingslingers, called Other Levels of the Tower, has had another new episode. This month we took a look at the Epics series Chapelwaite, which is based off of the Jerusalem's Lot short story that Stephen King wrote. This was a fun conversation we had. I think we both enjoyed the show quite a bit, and we actually broke the show down into a spoilers and non-spoilers section, because we figured so many of our listeners were going to be listening to people talk about Chapelwaite for maybe the first time, because I don't think many people watched the show. So if you are a patron or thinking about becoming a patron, and you're like, oh, well, I haven't watched the show yet, so I don't want to listen to that, there is like about a 15-20 minute section at the beginning where we just generally talk about the show. So you can still listen to that part.
Absolutely. It was a fun discussion. Like Scott said, we both really enjoyed it, and feel like it's a little bit of a shame that nobody has watched this show and nobody is talking about this show. Yeah. Because as far as things go, it is a very fun new Stephen King adaptation.
Absolutely. So you can check that out at our Patreon page. That's patreon.com/doofmedia. And you'll be able to get access to it at the Doof Troop level or above. And you'll find, I think there are now over 15 other episodes of Other Levels of the Tower out there as well, on a bunch of King adaptations. And fittingly, we will be doing Hearts in Atlantis next month. So this is good time to join the Patreon.
Yeah, and good timing.
All right, Matt, let's get into it. Let's talk about Low Men and Yellow Coats. I guess first at the beginning, before we get into the kind of more focused discussion, it's been a couple weeks now since you finished the story. Have your thoughts on it changed at all? Have you like as you've been further away from it, have you felt any differences in opinion or changes or how you thought of it overall?
No, I would say that it's just gelled a bit better. Mm-hmm. Now that I'm no longer kind of caught up in the moment to moment emotions of it, I can kind of stand back from it and think about it more as an artistic object, which, that it's funny. This is one of the things we always say about doing these in-depth analysis podcasts, is that they actually tend to breed a kind of analytical approach to stories, which is sometimes at odds with just feeling the stories. Sure. I think one interesting thing about Low Men and Yellow Coats specifically is that it's so powerful that I felt like it still affected me very strongly on an emotional level, even though I was approaching it with an analytical perspective and intent.
Sure.
So I don't know. I think that's one reason why it's good to have an overview conversation, is to remember all those moments of power, emotional power. I think I use the word power like 50 times discussing the story because it's kind of my go-to word when I want to say like it actually touches you in a real way that sticks with you.
Yeah. I mean, for my part, it was such a joy to see you react to this story, knowing everything that's coming. I feel like there was only 3 weeks long, but each week you brought a different emotion to the story, and in a way that I found really interesting. Like the first week, you were so enamored by just kind of the mundane existence of a boy in 1960 living his life. And I think that the first part of the story does such a wonderful job of establishing Bobby Garfield's everyday life and what he does. And it's just the kind of quiet, comfortable joy of Stephen King just like flexing his ability to write characters. And then, it gets darker and darker each week. And I watched you fall more in love with the story while also the story depressing you a little bit more and more as well, which is really interesting. Transfer over those 3 weeks.
I mean, it's funny in a very kind of superficial sense. The first week was my favorite because it made me happy, and it was like this love letter to childhood, and it made me remember what childhood was like in ways that I haven't thought about. But then, as you say, the book is kind of about growing up, and we move closer and closer to adulthood, and to this rather depressing view of what it is to grow up.
Yeah.
And that was, heavy, but, less enjoyable in the like, oh, this is beautiful sense, but just as enjoyable in the like, wow, I'm really reading something amazing.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, one of the things that I like, everyone talks, and we've talked about this before, about this whole thing with Stephen King and his endings being bad, and I think that's bullshit. We've talked about why that's bullshit. But just because I don't think his endings are bad doesn't mean that I don't often find myself enjoying the beginning of Stephen King books more than I'm enjoying the ending of them. I think the endings are good and usually the right endings, but like the first 100 to 200 pages of a Stephen King story, like when you're reading them for the first time, there's really nothing else like it, because it's just like, getting to know these characters who are fascinating and often despicable people, getting to understand the world and seeing little hints of what he's doing. It's so fun. It's so absolutely fun. And I love it so much. Like, I know I talked about 11/22/63 like a month ago when I said I was starting that for my Stephen King reread project, and I hadn't actually started it yet, and then a month went by, and I literally finally actually just started it this past week, and I read the first 200 pages in like a day, and it's just I love it so much. I love getting into a Stephen King book. So yeah, I think I agree with you that probably those first handful of chapters we did were my favorite as well. Not to say anything else after it was bad. It's just the beginnings of King novels are there's nothing else like them.
Yeah, he sweeps you up so well.
Yep. All right, let's move into our a little bit more structured discussion, not too much structure. And I wanted to start this week talking about Liz Garfield, who has to be the most complicated character in this book, perhaps one of the most complicated King characters ever. And the way I wanted to frame this discussion is around a comment that we got from one of our listeners, Pear Jane, who also happened to be the one that won the Do the King Thing contest. So everyone give Pear Jane a round of applause. Congratulations. But they said something really interesting that I wanted to kind of talk about to kind of frame this discussion about Liz Garfield. So Jane says, what really stood out to me this time was Liz's character. I've explicitly told my 10 and 12-year-old kids, if an adult tells you to keep a secret from me, that means you must tell me what the secret is. Kids should never be told to keep secrets from their parents. And what's the first thing Ted does? Tells Bobby to keep a secret. We know Ted's not grooming him or anything for anything illicit, but he sure as heck had the markers of a predator. Given the more innocent environment of 1960, Liz's suspicion is seen as paranoid and even cruel. But in 2021, it's an expectation of responsible parenting. I let my kids roam as much as they want to, but rules like tell me immediately about adults who tell you to keep secrets are part of the package. Of course, that really requires trust from both me and my kids, something Liz and Bobby don't really share, but right? Really? She was right to be suspicious of Ted's influence on Bobby. I totally agree with this. And I actually have had, when I was a kid, had the exact same conversation with my parents where they said, if an adult ever tells you to keep a secret, tell us immediately, because that's not good.
Yeah. I think the question for me is, to what degree did King want us to be concerned about that in this story? Like, did he want us to suspect that Ted was a predator and then gradually kind of warm up to him? Because I don't think so, actually.
That's interesting, because we came to the story knowing that Ted is a good dude overall, like a generally good dude who was not wanting to prey on Bobby in any way. But yeah, if you come to the story fresh, I don't think the tone of the story gives any hint that you're supposed to be actually worried about what Ted Brodigan's intentions with Bobby are. But interesting.
I mean, we're definitely supposed to understand why Liz would be suspicious.
Yeah.
But we're also supposed to feel like, no, she's wrong. I think that's pretty clear. Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, I definitely would be very skeptical, of an adult man that wanted to just like spend a lot of time with one of my kids in a way that, and it's funny because a big part of this, I'm going to be honest, is like just a sixth sense sort of thing where it's like my son's teacher, for example, is like, I don't want to say anything that could be construed as negative. It's just like kids often have a close relationship with their teacher. Mm-hmm. And I had a really close relationship with my teacher when I was his age, actually, a male teacher, in point of fact. And it was like very positive for me, and there was nothing weird about it. And I don't get a weird vibe from it. So I have no problem with it. It never crosses my mind that there could be something off. But like, I feel like I'm hyper critical of such relationships. And if I was even 1%, if I got even 1% a weird vibe, then I would try to, shut that down in some way. Does that make sense?
It does. I think that's really interesting. A part of this, as Jane points out, is the time, right? Like 1960 versus 2021, or perhaps more importantly, 1960 versus 1999 when the story was written, right? I think even 20 years ago, somehow 1999 is over 20 years ago, I think the idea that we're as innocent and trusting of other adults is already over in the time of King writing the story. So I do feel like this is something King is aware of as he puts pen to paper, establishing this relationship that we, the reader in 1999, probably, it's not that we're suspicious of Ted, but I think you're absolutely right. Our understanding of why Liz would be concerned with someone like this, like, and yeah, I mean, that's something I wanted to talk about as well. Another one of our listeners, Sigma, kind of wanted us to talk about this idea of the relationship between an adult and a child that isn't a parental relationship. Like we kind of mostly framed Ted and Bobby as a father-son relationship where they're not technically father and son, but because I think that is the framing that the book wants you to have. But I mean, it's an interesting angle to look at this. Like, as you said, you'd feel uncomfortable, and that's a teacher. Like, what if it's just a random dude, like, I mean, like, my kid's only a baby, so I haven't had to deal with anything remotely like this, but like just a strange adult starts talking to your child. Like, I feel like I would be immediately defensive if there's just a like, why do you want to talk to my child? Like, what do you want here? And I don't know if that's fair, because I think you're right that there can be very important, powerful, loving relationships between between adults and children that aren't a parent-child relationship. But I think I'm immediately defensive just even thinking about that.
Yeah, right. I think it's the sort of thing where I honestly don't know a better answer than just like pay attention and be aware of vibes, and pay attention to how your child is behaving. And sort of a corollary to that is like, know your child well enough that you will see in their behavior if there's anything slightly off, or if I'm grasping here because what I'm aiming at is something kind of ineffable and based on just your implicit understanding of your child and how they behave and how they think.
Sure. I mean, it's funny how often like the wise old mentor character exists in storytelling. The wise old mentor who is usually not blood related is such a very tried and true trope in storytelling. Like, I'm thinking of the Gandalf, Harry Potter, like this magic mentor in a lot of ways too. And the story, the story always exists in a world in which everyone's just fine with it, because that's not what the story's about. But it is interesting. This story kind of forces you, maybe barely forces you, but definitely forces you to consider it, because from Liz's eyes, as Jane has pointed out, like, she's totally within her right to be incredibly nervous about this whole weird thing that's happening.
Yeah. I'm just trying to think, like, if one of my kids, like, after school activity teachers or whatever, because they're a sort of mentor in a specific way. But if they were like, I really like your kid, I wonder if they would like to come over and read the newspaper to me. I would be like, I'd probably just be like, no, that's weird. No, unless I like knew them really well personally.
I do think I think the reason why so many of these stories just slip these relationships into the parent-child paradigm is because of this exact reason. Like, just like we don't know what to do with a relationship between an adult and a child that isn't some sort of parent-kid thing. We just don't know. It just feels wrong in so many ways.
Yeah, well, I think a big part of it is like, what are you getting out of this? Like, why are you interested in a close relationship with a child? What?
Yeah,
it's hard to articulate. I'm really struggling with this conversation. Like, okay, so I did want to say, like, all of my kids are under 10 years old, which I see as just like a wholly vulnerable and naive kind of age, where like they're just not aware of the ways in which adults might be trying to take advantage of them, and they're just super vulnerable to that right now.
Yeah, which I think Bobby falls under that for sure.
I think Bobby falls. I think the point of Bobby's character being 11 or whatever, I think 11, right, is that he's on the cusp of starting to be aware of these things, but he's not fully aware of them.
Sure.
But I think once you're a year or two older than Bobby, then it's like you're kind of on the the young adult. That's what adolescence is. Yeah. It's the transition zone, and then you can give the kid more free reign, and then you can kind of imagine different sorts of relationships. But like, I think the thing that comes into my mind is like, you ask the adult, like, what are you after here? Because you're not getting the same kind of bonding that you'd be getting with an adult. So what are you getting?
Yeah. So what in your mind was Ted getting?
I mean, he was terribly lonely. He couldn't really have normal friends. He never had a family, as far as I recall. And he just, I think he at first mainly saw Bobby as a kindred spirit, like he said, and then he came to see him as a son that he really just loved and cared about as a son. And that was kind of an organic process that he didn't intend to happen. That's just what happened.
Yeah, I mean, one thing we forgot to talk about last week was that we were kind of explicitly told that Bobby is not, nor ever would be, a breaker, right? That the power he had in the short chapters that he had power was given entirely by Ted. So Ted's, interest in him is not related to he sees another breaker. Like he sees a kindred spirit in some ways, but it's not in this specific, oh, we both have this power and therefore outcasts in this world. It's something a little bit different than that. But I think you're right. I think that's what he gets out of him for sure. And I don't know. I don't know if that's like, I don't know if that's a good thing. You know, I don't know if it's a good thing for an adult to be relying on a very young child for that kind of relationship. I don't know.
Yeah, no, and I don't think it's necessarily portrayed as being a good thing. It's more just like he's this super desperate, lonely old man, and there were moments in this book this time around, and I kind of shied away from them in our analysis. I think we brought it up the first time, and then kind of didn't bring it up again. But we talked about it last week that this book is very into the concept of touch, and there are multiple moments in this book, even after the first one, where King reminds us of the way Ted touches Bobby in ways that scare him, but also comfort him. And I still don't know where to slot all that in my mind, because like we are specifically connected back to a sexual touch with that. Like the first time Ted touches Bobby in that way, he said it's like someone does when they're about to make out with someone, Mm-hmm.
And a lot of this could just be Bobby's naivete. I don't want to say it's not that, but I had trouble slotting that, and it made me uncomfortable every time I read it. And I was like, what are we, am I made to feel uncomfortable? Is this just my 2021 showing? And I don't know.
Yeah, I don't know either. I mean, I think the interpretation that I sort of settled on was the idea that touch is dangerous because it's exposing yourself to the possibility of being hurt.
Mm-hmm.
That's just one possible interpretation, obviously. Like one thing that I think about is, and maybe this is more, I don't know, this seems like maybe it's a Southern thing, honestly, because I know that there's a lot of cultures where there's a lot more like kissing and hugging,
mm-hmm.
Even between men. But like at a certain point, it like the idea of my dad kissing me on the cheek or anything, really at all, became kind of weird and uncomfortable, and vice versa. But where there obviously there was an age where he would give me a peck on the cheek or a kiss on the head or whatever, and that's, I don't know if that's at all related to what we're talking about here. But it might be, it seems related to in some way.
Yeah, I mean, I think it is, in that this is all kind of wrapped into this understanding of like what is loving and appropriate touch between an adult and a child. When that adult is the parent and when that adult is not the parent, and because I was thinking about this the other day, because I have a baby and I give my baby kisses on his cheek all the time because he's he's a little baby. And so I was thinking about like, at what time am I going to be like, oh, I can't do that anymore? That'd be weird. And I mean, this is all cultural, right? But it is important, and it is something. And I don't know. I don't have any clear answers here for sure.
That is a weird thing. I've thought about that too, because I'll give my son a kiss on the head, but not on the cheek. And it's like, I never decided that. That's just kind of a thing that my brain decided that was what we're doing now.
Yeah. And you're right. It's totally regional, because my upstate New York Italian family does the like side of the cheek kiss thing every time they see each other, and I've never been comfortable with that in my life. Mm-hmm. I never know what to do during those situations. I'm like, oh, this is weird. Yeah, me too. And part of me feels kind of sad about that, because it's like if I could push the button to be okay with that kind of thing, then I would, because I don't think there's anything wrong with it. I'm just, due to my own upbringing, it's like, that's not how it's done, Yeah.
So
it's weird. I don't know. I don't think we got to the bottom of any answers here, but I do think I thank both Pear Jane and Sigma for kind of allowing us to look down the different avenues for the stuff that we maybe originally thought, because I agree, Pear Jane, that if I were Bobby's mother, I would be extremely suspicious of a man asking to have my son over to read the newspaper. Super suspicious.
Yeah, I mean, it's something we never really talked about at all in our main chapter readings, and it definitely is an interesting topic.
Yeah. So speaking of Ted, I wanted to kind of spend some time talking about Ted and maybe talking about not just the Ted that appears in this book. This is kind of brought on by one of our listeners, Serena K, who said, "To me, the Ted Brodigan in Algol Siento and the one in Low Man in Yellow Coats just don't match. I mean, I get that there's kind of two Teds in two completely different places. With Bobby, he's on the run, savoring his freedom. When the Ted catches up with him, he's been in Algol Siento for years, maybe even centuries. He's become cynical, destroying the world with his hands kind of tied. But still, they don't even remotely feel like the same person to me. Do you guys feel the same? And if so, do you think that was King's intention?" What do you think, Matt?
I definitely feel what you're saying here. I think the idea is that we're seeing Ted from Bobby's point of view,
Mm-hmm.
and that character is very much limbed with gold and perfect relative to who we eventually find Ted to be when we hear his story from his own mouth, and then we kind of see his behavior. I mean, when it's not like it's a jarring clash, is what I would say. I would just say that Bobby doesn't get him as a whole human being. Bobby sees him from the perspective of a child, and when we get him from the perspective of ultra cynical Roland, we see a much more three-dimensional and kind of flawed human being.
Yeah, I agree with that. I'd be lying if I said I noticed a big difference between the two. Like, there was never any time where I was reading Low Men in Yellow Coats where I was like, this guy doesn't even seem like Ted. That never happened to me. But I do think they are very different people, and it has to do with everything that he's gone through, for sure. And I agree that it is. There's a read of this whole thing that the Ted we see in the story is really just Bobby's memory of the whole thing, right? That not only are we in Bobby's perspective for most of the story, but it's Bobby kind of recalling things that happened to him when he was a child. And so, I mean, we were just talking about Titanic the other week. This is why this is on my mind, because we just talked about Titanic on the Doofcast last week, and how the character of Jack is this perfect angel because he is just a memory of that person that Rose created when retelling the story of Titanic. And there might be some of that here, that this is just Bobby's memory of who Ted Brodigan was. He's this guy who came into his life, was there for, maybe a couple weeks, maybe. And he felt a deep, passionate, father-son type of love for him, I think, and remembers him very, very fondly. And so we don't see that. I mean, that is the interesting thing about the story, Matt, is, you and I talked about the everything in the subtext of the story that Bobby never really deals with directly. And I think a lot of that is what is going on in Ted's head is mostly kept from us. Yeah.
It's, I think almost entirely. I don't actually remember any moments where I felt like we kind of dipped into Ted's perspective.
No.
The closest we'll get is obviously when he's sharing his, literary analysis insights. Mm-hmm. I think it's slightly tragic to think about, but it seems clear to me that Ted is much more important to Bobby than Bobby is to Ted. Like Ted definitely really thinks of Bobby as an important kid, but his mind is focused on completely different matters of much greater import pretty much the whole story.
Yeah.
And Bobby is this kid who happens to live in the same building, and it's not unimportant, but it's not his whole life, like it is kind of Bobby's whole life here.
Sure. Well, let me ask you a question. So we talked last week about the extremely cynical and borderline nihilistic collection of books that Ted was asking Bobby to read. Was he just saying, this is my mindset because this is how I'm feeling right now? Or was he cultivating a collection specifically to teach Bobby something?
Oh, I think he was cultivating something. I think he was trying to put together a kind of thesis about humanity and how you can't rely on other people to solve your problems, and other people are basically inherently have deep monstrosity inside them. Maybe it's not quite the same thing as saying other people are monsters, mm-hmm. but other people are capable of monstrosity, I think is a theme of all of those stories. And yeah, you've got to be cautious. You got to learn to be a bit cynical to protect yourself, but at the same time, not completely cynical, because obviously there is the opportunity for these amazing powerful, close relationships like the one between Ted and Bobby.
Yeah. So if Ted got the opportunity to kind of finish his lesson fully, what do you think? What is the capstone of his literary journey for Bobby? Like, what is the book that this might be a very difficult question to answer on hand, but what is the book that really nails what Ted's thesis is?
Oh yeah, no, I definitely don't have anything offhand to give you. Like, I think, I mean, one thing that I've learned over the course of doing our 50 books for our book club is like, you're never done. There's always more books where it's like, I never thought of seeing the world in this way, even if it's just a genre, more or less fun, entertaining book. You can still get something that you take away from that book that changes the way you see the world. And so I don't really think that there is such a thing as like, read these 6 books and then you're done and you will understand humanity.
Sure. You could have just answered Low Men in Yellow Coats and I would have given you a round of applause.
Okay. Yeah. Well, sure.
It's too late now. It's too late.
Okay.
Okay. Let's talk about women, Matt. You know how much we love talking about women. But I think the thing we specifically wanted to talk about is our listener Brick said both this story and Insomnia share the violence towards women motif. Now, Insomnia was published prior to Wizard and Glass, while Low Men comes out between that and Wolves. The whole Susan story from Wizard and Glass is also pretty heavy on the violence and general abuse of women. Do you think this was just on King's mind in the 90s, or is there a deeper Tower-connected reason for all these stories to lean heavily into that particular atrocity? Very good question. I will say generally, we've said this before, but I'll say it again. Stephen King in the 90s is very much into examining why people hurt women specifically. Like Insomnia, Gerald's Game, Dolores Claiborne, Rose Madder. This technically, Wizard and Glass can fall in there, sure. It's very much something that was on his mind a lot in this time period of his career. And it's interesting to kind of dive into why. And I really like the second half of this question is there a deeper Tower connected reason for these stories to lean on this particular kind of atrocity? And I mean, well, first of all, before I get into it, what do you think, Matt?
I guess I would Tower connected in the sense that we do have this theme throughout the Dark Tower books of sexuality and violence and magic and kind of all these ideas being tied up together, where there's power and magic in sexuality, but there's also a sort of darkness, and there's this motif they identified where there's clearly like romantic, beautiful, positively valenced love, and then there's more overtly sexual, like low motives, sort of instant gratification type lust. And that these are like the two axes, and that sometimes they play off each other. And I imagine that violence against women could fall into this matrix somewhere, particularly in what we would call the pink. So I would just in a brief sentence, consolidating what I just said, the Tower connection would be through the idea of the pink.
Mm-hmm. I like that. I'm going to try to get weird here, so let's see if this works out. I have an idea of where I'm going to go, and I don't know if I'm going to be able to get there, but the Tower is the center of Stephen King's universe, right? Mm-hmm. Roland is arguably the center of that tower, and one of the things I think we learned in our dissection of the Dark Tower is that as much as everyone says you have not forgotten the face of your father, the most important relationship in Roland's life is with his mother, and what happened to her and what he did to her, the violence that he committed to her, is one of the things that most defines who he is as a person and why he becomes the person he becomes, and how that violence is perpetuated again and again and again against all the women in his life, either directly or indirectly. And so this idea of violence against women being this central Stephen King thing makes sense when at the center of Stephen King's universe is this guy who did a matricide. Like, it's one of the first things we learn about Roland is he did a matricide before we even know how it went down. That is his defining trait. And so I think it just it kind of ties the Stephen King multiverse in this very interesting bow, where this is the world, and it's the world because Roland is at the center of it, and that's what he does.
I love that. Yeah, I mean, I always remember how hard it hit that we got through the entirety of Wizard and Glass, and he's told this story about Susan and you think that this book was basically so he could tell the story of Susan, and then you realize, no, he told the story of Susan so that he could build up to telling the story of his mom, which is what has actually been fucking him up for his entire life.
Yeah.
Like, yeah, he's been screwed up about Susan's death, but that's not the thing that he almost can't say and kind of breaks down while telling is when he shot his mother. So yeah, I think you're right on there.
Yeah. I mean, it's so wonderful because it's such a good fake out. You're right that like we're built to believe that this whole thing is about Susan and yeah, not to take anything away from Susan's death. It's tragic and awful, but his mother's death is the one thing he can't even, he goes through this horrible Susan episode that destroys him. And yet he can't even in the moment bring himself to tell the story of his mother. Like that part of the story has to be forced out of him through confrontation with the glass, right? Like it is going into that crystal tower at the end of this book, or Emerald Tower, the Emerald City, encountering the Wizard of Oz, who is our man Flag, and seeing the pink ball again that kind of forces the story out of Roland. So he wasn't going to tell them, probably. He wasn't going to get to that part because that is even more his everlasting shame than Susan's death.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, exactly. I like that connection. Yeah, that makes a ton of sense. And as you say, this being the thing on which his whole cosmos hinges, it reminds me of the moment when Bobby raises his fist to his mom. Mm-hmm. And it's this terribly sad moment where it's sort of, the encapsulation of the loss of innocence is you can no longer, I mean, it's sad for both sides. From the kid's side, from Bobby's side, it's like you no longer trust that your mother is your protector and your advocate in this world, and you have to now defend yourself against your mother with your fists, which means basically in your own mind, Bobby, no one is on your side.
Yeah. The betrayal of the parent as a protector thing is one of the most tragic and horrifying things that could ever happen. And I think it's a well that Stephen King has returned to. Like we were just talking about Gerald's Game. That is something that occurs in that story as well. And, I think I'm going to speculate here. And again, I do not know Stephen King. I have never talked with Stephen King yet, but a lot of people look at how often he returns to that violence against women and they conclude that he likes it. They make an analysis of the author himself that says, well, he enjoys allowing his characters to do these things to women. And I think it's the exact opposite. I think it's a thing that horrifies him more than anything else. And he writes about the terrible, the horrifying, the unspeakable stuff. And it is one of the most unspeakable things. And so he is inherently fascinated with how could a person do that? How could a person hurt a person like that? How could a person do one of the most horrible things I can think of? And so he wants to walk into that dark room and shine a light on that thing to attempt to understand it himself. And I think that's why, again, back to Roland, he's the core character at the center of all this Stephen King stuff. And we had him do it too. And so he's fascinated by how these people work.
Yeah, no, I think that's right. I mean, I don't like to psychoanalyze the author in general, but if I were going to, I wouldn't say, oh, Stephen King secretly wants to beat up his wife. I would say something more like, I wonder if something happened in the mid-90s that made him aware of this issue more strongly than he had been before. That this kind of brought it front and center to his mind as something really upsetting that he felt a need to explore. That
is a good question, and one that I wish we knew the answer to. But I've kind of done a cursory examination and didn't find anything or find an instance where he talks about specifically why he chose to go to this particular place with his career. I don't know the answer. When we get that interview, that's one of the things we'll ask him.
Yeah, sounds good. Well, let me write that down.
All right. Okay, so let's talk about the Low Men a bit. Matt, you want to read this
Sure.
response from Like a Fox?
Like a Fox says, one thing of note regarding the discussion of low men and how they're portrayed here versus in the main series is I don't want to think sorry, is I don't think it has to be taken as a semi-retcon by King. If I remember, there's at least twice, once in Wolves, once in Low Men, that the Low Men are thrown together in a list of various baddies, including regulators and big coffin hunters, which leads me to believe that Low Men could function as a title for various foot soldiers, lackeys, enforcers, etc. of the Crimson King. So maybe there are low men that are Cantoi, and there can still be low men that are these shifting and psychic things in this story, and they don't have to fundamentally cancel each other out. At least this is the bend in logic I'm willing to employ in my head to allow both cool concepts to exist.
And we got a few comments from people about this that said a similar thing, that just because they are Cantoi, just because Cantoi are low men does not mean, I mean, we know that not all Cantoi are low men, and to say that not all low men are Cantoi. I like that. I don't know if there's anything specifically in the text that hints towards that in a concrete kind of way.
Yeah, I guess the only thing that there are people with the blue coffin tattoo, which seems to mean something else. So, I mean, it's the sort of thing where you're almost forced to accept something like this must be the case if you want to assume that the universe is consistent. You know?
Sure. Yeah, and that's just not a thing I care about. And frankly, I loved the conclusion that we got to in last week's episode about this so much that I'm totally fine with the low men being different now, because it's so wonderful.
Yeah.
Here at the end of the story, looking back, what are your thoughts on the low men? Like what are you going to carry about the low men from this book?
I mean, it's, I guess, mainly the idea of a certain very dark interpretation of adulthood, because in my mind, again, I don't know, maybe this is just me. I don't know if this is clearly textual, but this is what I walked away with, is the idea that growing up is actually growing low for most people, because you lose your innocence and you become kind of corrupted. You sharpen a stick at both ends and you go out into the world and kind of become a bit of a monster, or at least there's a big risk that you will. And the low men are like the sci-fi fantasy escalation of this idea. Like this is almost all of the bad parts about adulthood and or mankind consolidated into just these beings that are just purely, they just want to hurt people. They just want to torture. They're so bad that they terrify even the lowlifes at the bar, because you know that the lowlifes in the bar are fundamentally just scared, but the low men are not scared of anything. They are just nightmare creatures.
Yeah.
And so that's the main thing that I think about when I think about the low men.
Yeah, I like that. Here's something I've been thinking about, and this is not a fully formed opinion, so if I lose it along the way, please forgive me. But I've been thinking about the low men a lot, and I've been thinking about, we talked a lot during the course of the book about why are the low men employing these signs of childhood, right? Like the hopscotch and the kite strings and the lost pet posters and all these things. Why are they employing these things? And I was thinking how this book uses the phrase low men a lot to talk about people that are not the titular low men in yellow coats, right? Every time Bobby has experienced a new person or realized a new person is not good, not a good person, he relates them, he reflects them off of the low men. And I was thinking about that phrase, low men in yellow coats. And I was thinking about these people, these low men who wear these garish yellow coats, who drive around in these monstrous vehicles. They are a child's approximation of what bad is, right? It is garish. It is easy to spot. It is easy to suss out. When you're around them, you feel it immediately. You feel it psychically in your head that they're bad. There's no question. There's no complexity. They are the bad guys. And every other quote unquote low man in the story is not that right away. They have to reveal that to you. The guy who's swindling them with the card game, the realtor, the St. Gabe boys, right? Like the low men that exist in this world that we as human beings have to encounter every day do not wear yellow coats. They do not have signifiers. They do not put moons and stars next to hopscotch things. They're just out there, and we have to look out for them, and we have to pay attention. And that is truly the scariest thing of all, is that the monsters in the real world don't wear gaudy things that allow us to recognize them as monsters.
Yeah, they don't announce themselves. I had a thought which has been bouncing around my head. I never took it seriously until this moment, but I'm sending you an image on. No, sorry, I'm going to drop the image into our script here. It's on it's on the next page. So I was thinking about Dick Tracy. Dick Tracy is a guy who was in a movie that came out in the mid 90s. If I'm not mistaken.
Yes, that is not the origin of Dick Tracy, but yes, you are correct.
No, but the movie came out, and we've previously established that maybe King is influenced by movies that he saw recently in some instances. And Dick Tracy wears a yellow coat, and he has a ridiculously garish yellow car that looks, in my opinion, exactly the way these low men cars are described. Mm-hmm. So I'm not saying Dick Tracy's a low man. The closest thing that I am to saying that is, I think maybe Stephen King watched the Dick Tracy movie and was like, isn't it funny how they depict all of the characters in this movie, all of the villains look cartoonishly evil.
It's insane what they did with this movie.
It's completely over the top, right? All of the monsters all of the mobsters look like monsters.
They took the comic book, exaggerated comic book faces, and they just said, let's do that in live action.
Yeah, let's put Al Pacino in that makeup, exactly. And that's a funny thing, because it's like, well, yeah, in reality, mobsters look like just normal men, and they wear, at most, they'll wear a slightly flashy suit, which a kid might not even recognize as being a flashy suit, you know. So I don't know. The Dick Tracy connection is definitely something that I'm glad that I finally had an opportunity to say out loud, because the low men to Dick Tracy connection is actually, I think, potentially a valid connection, even though Dick Tracy himself is not a bad guy.
I know. I think you're right. I feel like that was at least on King's mind when he was creating these characters, for sure. Like, look at that car. Look at that. That's a fucking ridiculous car. You turn that car purple, it's a low man car.
Exactly. Yeah.
I think that's a good transition to kind of where we wanted to finish the conversation here, which is about the rest of this book. You know, we just read the first story of this book, and first we have Brett 7921 who asks, are you, Matt, going to finish the whole Hearts in Atlantis book? Or are you going to just stop here? And for the record, you have my permission to read the rest of this book if you want to.
And the answer is, I actually wished that I had finished it prior to this conversation, because I kind of wish that we had been able to talk about it here, although we didn't warn people. Yeah. So I guess it's okay that we did not. And also, I just didn't have enough time.
If we didn't have 10 hours of Chapel Wait to watch, we maybe could have fit it in.
Yes, it is absolutely Chapel Wait's fault, but I don't feel bad about that. So yes, I do intend to finish it. I just did not have time.
That kind of moves into Walking Dude 22's question, or at least statement, who says, I feel like taking the story on its own merit does a disservice to Bobby's arc. The Low Men novella is a part of the larger Hearts in Atlantis work, and to an extent it relies upon the themes and events of the other stories in Hearts to fulfill the story. The Hearts title comes from the second part of the book. It literally refers to the hard game carts, but thematically it means so much more. It seems to me that Low Men is a fall from grace story, as many coming-of-age stories are. The book, however, is a redemption story, so I feel like Low Men is cheapened by the loss of the supporting stories. I think... So here's, Matt, where I attempt to talk to you about what Hearts in Atlantis is about without spoiling every single story in Hearts in Atlantis.
Okay.
So, in my opinion, Hearts in Atlantis is a story about Stephen King reckoning with the failure of his generation to do anything after the 60s. Like so we've talked about the 60s as this time of turbulent change in the country, right? Like, this is established via Low Men and Yellow Coats as being 1960, and this idea of loss of innocence and discovery. We've talked about these things. And the rest of the book goes on to outline kind of what happens as we move through the 60s into the 90s, and what happened as the Stephen King baby boomer generation. What did they do? What did they become? What did they accomplish? And I think King is being very critical of himself and his generation of what they did or did not accomplish, the hopes and dreams of a society that is looking at itself for the first time and what they're going to do and what they're going to change with those looks, and his disappointment, his general disappointment in their failure to do so.
Okay. Fascinating.
Yeah. So I think that doesn't spoil the story specifically. Maybe you'll spot things he's doing in those stories. And again, someone could disagree with this opinion. I don't know. I've never really talked to anyone about Hearts in Atlantis, so I'm not an expert on this at all. But I like what Walking Dude said, and I agree that Bobby's story under that framing takes on some different meaning. I will say, as just another, there is a very short, like 30-page denouement story where we return to the point of Bobby in 1999, an old man. I think he's 50. About Stephen King's age, not accidentally, returning to his childhood home and kind of reckoning with his past. And that's all I'm going to say about it. And I think that puts a cap on the Low Men in Yellow Coat story and on the book as a whole in a really interesting way. So I do agree that I don't know if it does a disservice to the story to not look at the work as a whole, but I do agree that Hearts in Atlantis is a very unique collection in that all these stories relate to each other very, very specifically. There are characters that appear in each of them, and thematically they are all telling an individual story on its own.
That's really interesting. Yeah. So it's almost more like it's a novel in several parts.
Yeah.
With a lot more integrity to each of the parts than you would normally expect.
Correct. Yeah. All the characters from the character from Bobby's childhood show up again. We see Carol Gerber again. We see SJ again. We see another character I won't mention here again as well. And that what happens to them is pretty important.
Okay. Yeah. Well, see, I'm framing it this way to incept myself into thinking that it's just a novel that I haven't finished instead of several more short stories that I need to read.
Yeah. And honestly, I wrestled with the idea of whether we should just go ahead and cover this whole thing a lot. And I went back and forth, and like my first week reading Low Men in Yellow Coats, I almost just said, fuck it, we're just going to read this whole book. But we've got so much other stuff to cover. And I want to come back and have a detailed conversation with you about this book. Maybe we'll do it as like a one-off in between books someday in the future after you finish it. Because I want that to happen. It just didn't fit the theme of our show right now, and I didn't want to make another huge change to the schedule that's going to push us back even more, because it would be we would spend another 3 months on this book probably.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, maybe I'll finish reading it at some point. Maybe we can do a Hearts in Atlantis story collection recap or something like that.
And I will say I love this book as a whole. I love all the other stories. I think they're good. I think Hearts in Atlantis is the most classic King story in that he just makes a story about something and you're like, how could you make an actual whole ass story about this thing? And then he does it. But I do think from a writing perspective, I do think Low Men in Yellow Coats is just the best written story in the bunch. So you got the best of the best. You're missing out on some stuff for sure, but it's not like you're going to be like, oh my God, I can't believe you didn't tell me about Blind Willie, the best story I've ever read.
Okay. I'm very curious though. So
kind of a throwaway question from Steve D, if you want to read that one.
Yeah, Steve says, what came first to Psy King, the story or the Dark Tower connection?
That's an interesting question. Do you have any theory here?
I went back and forth on it, and I think I would say 60-40 the Dark Tower connection, actually. Like my guess, just a guess, is that he was thinking about the Dark Tower. He was thinking about the idea of the breakers and the Devar toy or whatever, the seed of that idea was. And he thought about the idea of some breaker who tried to run away. And then he thought about that breaker taking refuge with the family. And then I think in total Stephen King style, got completely sidetracked with the idea of the family and the boy that the breaker was taking refuge with. And then he realized that was where the heart of the story was, because that's how he thinks. He thinks in terms of where is the actual emotion. But I would not, I'll put it this way, I would not be at all surprised to learn that the seed of the story was Ted, not Bobby. But then he realized that it needed to be Bobby's story.
going into that, I was going to disagree with you, but I think you've convinced me. I think that sounds like a very Stephen King thing to do. Just the entire concept of just becoming fascinated with Bobby, which I mean, begs the question: did he like? And I don't know the truth of this. Like, how did this collection come together? Like, did he write a one-off story and then have another idea and then realize he could tie these ideas together, or did he set out to write this in a novel type way? Where I don't know the answer to that question either. But no, I love this idea that he heard the song, right? He heard the song, the Turtle song, and decided to talk about Ted. I guess the question I'll have for you though is, I see this a lot now that I'm in the Dark Tower community. I spent a lot of time on the subreddit reading things. I don't actually talk there very often, but a lot of people talk. There's this constant kind of back and forth talking about what books do you have to read before reading the Dark Tower? And the answer to that is, in my opinion, none of them. You don't have to read any of them. But what is your opinion on this book? Like, are you glad you met Ted in the Dark Tower before you met Ted here? Or do you feel like something was lost in that Low Men and Yellow Coats was not the first time you met Ted Brodigan?
I don't really feel like anything was lost. The only thing that I can think of is, like, I was never skeptical of Ted. I always knew that he was basically a good guy. Sure. But I honestly think that this book kind of goes out of its way to make sure that you're not skeptical of Ted. So
yeah, I just feel like, we joke about Stephen King and subtlety, but I think, like, if he wanted you to know that Ted was someone you should feel worried about, like, he would have just said it.
Yeah.
He would have just been like, and Ted is clearly a monster. Yeah.
And besides, I mean, I already knew that Anthony Hopkins gets taken away in the car by the Low Man at the end of the movie. So, which, by the way, I never pictured Ted as Anthony Hopkins while reading this book.
Oh, interesting.
I don't know if you did, but I didn't see. Yeah, I don't know. Maybe it's something to do with the fact that William Hurt's voice is just not at all the way Anthony Hopkins does the character. And so I just invented a new whole persona and face for him.
Yeah. I think I read this before I saw the movie, so I didn't either, but I feel like I'm surprised to hear that, because I feel like if you would see the movie, you would just think Anthony Hopkins the whole time.
Anthony Hopkins has a very particular way of playing characters, and that's just not the way that I saw this character. I didn't see him as being the same dude that Anthony Hopkins was being.
Yeah. So the next thing I wanted to talk about is the concept of, bleak, depressing stories. We talked about this last week, where the stories that Ted was having Bobby read, and also arguably the story that is Low Men and Yellow Coats. And one of our listeners, Michelle Y, talked about they read and reread a lot of King. They said they've been reading King since the 5th grade, cutting my teeth with Christine and never looking back. I read a lot and reread King a lot. For example, I reread every Tower book before I reread every Tower book before the release of the next book, and have reread the entire 7.5 books an additional 3 to 4 times. But the one exception to all this, they've reread It and The Stand multiple times. But one of their big exceptions is Hearts in Atlantis. They have not reread Hearts in Atlantis very much. And they say, I find most of King books, even the really dark ones, have a silver lining of catharsis at the end, or at least a classical Greek tragedy, pity/fear catharsis that leaves me hopeful and or thinking deep. But a few works, mostly those under the Bachman handle, are just bleak or mostly bleak, kind of like Steinbeck. And I guess Michelle is putting Hearts in Atlantis, or at least Low Men and Yellow Coats, in that same bucket as those Bachman books. So I guess we talked about this last week, generally, that we do think this book does have a hopeful, optimistic ending to it, or at least this short story. But what's your, there's some people out there that can't do bleak storytelling, like they just don't want to read books about nihilism, or books where like nothing good happens to any of the characters. And I'm wondering what your opinion on that generally is.
I mean, probably complicated, to be honest. It's funny because just within the last 24 hours or so, I finished reading the Cixin Liu, apologies for the mispronunciation, 3 Body Problem trilogy. And basically the first thing I did after processing it for a bit was to just vent to Scott about how depressing and nihilistic I found it. But I'm totally glad I read it. I found it incredibly creative, and the way in which it was a downer that got me thinking. And so it's like, I can't read too many of those books. Like, I definitely have to intersperse them with lighthearted fare and hopeful stuff, you know. But I think you have to read some of that stuff. I'm sympathetic. I'm sympathetic to what Michelle is saying here. Like, I very rarely want to reread those books, but I'm generally glad that I read them in the first place. That's my feeling. What do you feel about bleak, depressing books, Scott?
Love them.
Okay.
I do. I one of my favorite writers, not books but television, is a guy named Taylor Sheridan, who our friend Michael despises for this exact reason, actually, that he just writes bleak, depressing shit. That's just what he does. I mean, Sicario, Wind River. He's working in television right now, doing a show called Yellowstone, and also another show called Mayor of Easttown. And Mayor of Easttown is basically, what if everything was terrible, and like, imagine every piece of corruption that any police force has ever done in the history of any kind of police force, and it's all centered in this one town, and they're doing it all day every day, and it's just like, there's no, our main character is like a part of that system. He's not even like a guy trying to take that system down. He's actually the one facilitating the conversations between prison guards and cops and prisoners and gangs. And it's just like, I don't know where the ending of the show is, because I think it's just the guy's going to die, because I don't understand how he's going to get out of this without dying. But I love it. And I think you're right that the idea of like visiting those worlds and revisiting those worlds is never something that's going to be high on my priority list. Like, the Taylor Sheridan movie Wind River is just an incredibly bleak movie in which, like, there's a sense of catharsis, but it's like, it's not a happy movie. And I watched that movie. I loved that movie. I have never rewatched it, and I will never rewatch it. So I think I agree with both you and Michelle in that these things are good and important to read, but like, you know, there's certain books that you can reread, and there's certain books that you just don't need to revisit.
Yeah, they do their work in one go. And I mean, also, you know, if you reread a bleak book, then it doesn't really hit you the same way, because you kind of know what you're getting. Yeah. Like, the thing about okay, let me decontextualize this so that I'm not spoiling any particular book. But like, you read a book the first time through, and you don't know until the end whether it's going to be a bleak book, because it could totally end with some moment of catastrophe where suddenly everything turns around and goes well, and you know, the person's faith is rewarded, and everything turns out well, and you know, they're reunited with their lover, and it's just wonderful, right? Or it could end exactly the opposite of that in every way. And then once you know the answer to that, you know, kind of question, that kind of mystery, it's not going to be the same experience rereading it. You just already know. You just already exactly know how it's going to end. So
sure, yeah. I do think some of the pleasure of these type of books has to be, well, surely things are going to turn around for this character eventually, right? My wife was just watching a TV show called The Maid, which I learned only afterwards is based on a memoir. So like, when you know a show is being based on a memoir, you kind of know the main character is going to be okay by the end of the show. But it's about this woman who's working as a maid, you know, struggling to get ends meet, who also has a daughter. And it's just like the trials and tribulations of being an incredibly poor person in this country, you know, living paycheck to paycheck. And it's just, for like 9 episodes, just like everything keeps going wrong. Like, if she gets any semblance of good news, something else happens, and it's incredibly difficult to watch. But yeah, if I had known it was based on a memoir while I was, you know, watching it over her shoulder with her, I think I would have been much less like, Jesus, what is the fucking point of all this? You know, because I do think at some point when you're reading something that's bleak, or we can go so far as to say nihilistic, you have to be asking yourself, what are they trying to say with this? Like, is it just the world? There's nothing but despair and happiness is fleeting and there's no sense in anything. Is that really the conclusion that the author is making, or are they using the nihilism to make a larger point about humanity and existence? And I think when you start telling stories like this, you need to, I don't want to say you need, because there's no hard fast rule about this, but I need for those stories to at least be using the nihilism to make a point beyond just nihilism for the sake of nihilism.
Yeah, make me ask some kind of question about the nature of existence.
Yeah.
And maybe the answer, I think you have to be open to the idea that you can ask questions about the nature of existence and the answer will be something you didn't want to hear.
Sure.
And I think that is maybe the approach that a lot of these Bleak books are taking, is like, who said that the answer to life, the universe, and everything was going to make you feel affirmed and comfortable in your choices in life? Like that is written nowhere. So, open yourself to the possibility that it is going to be bleak. Like I thought Lord of the Flies was a super bleak book when I read it as a kid, and much bleaker than Hearts in Atlanta, than Low Men and Yellow Coats, actually, because that's a book that this is a book that ended with at least a note of like Ted remembered him. There was a real relationship. like just
Sure.
imagine, like, again, I like to do this thought experiment and just be like, imagine if this book ended with just, he never heard from Ted again. The end.
Yeah.
Land's kind of different.
See, I just like, with some exceptions, I think King can't ever do true nihilism. I think he's too much of a softie, and I think he needs to put those little bits in there that just lead you towards just a little smidgen of hope or optimism. Or
yeah. He loves Lord of the Rings. Of course, he's an emotional softie. Yeah.
All right. I wanted to briefly talk about the adaptation, not in a lot of detail, because, as I said, we're going to be doing this on other levels of the tower. But we already talked about whether Ted was Anthony Hopkins, which is what AL84001 asked, if we could see Ted as anyone but Anthony Hopkins. And I guess the answer to that question for you is yes. Do you see William Hurt in your head as Ted now?
No, I honestly sort of invented an entirely new kind of old man face. But I definitely hear his voice as William Hurt's voice now. So,
God, it's so fascinating. Like I went back and I listened to more, and I listened to the weird thing about the Hearts in Atlantis audiobook is that it's like a tag team between William Hurt and Stephen King himself. I think King reads Hearts in Atlantis, that story, and then William Hurt picks it up from there. So I reread the final little short 30-page thing at the end, or I re-listened, I guess, whatever. And man, he makes such fascinating choices. William Hurt makes, and they're never like bad choices. It's just like, if you sat me in front of this text and said, Scott, read this out loud, I would never make the choice that he makes. I mean, that's why he's a famous actor and I'm a podcaster, but it's a really interesting audiobook. I like it.
Yeah, no, I agree totally that like he does line reads in a way where you're like, I never would have done that. But like, that's why, like, he's clearly thinking about it and thinking about like, what's a way to do this where it lands without being just a cliche, boring way of doing it.
Yeah. And good news for everyone. The Everything's Eventual audiobook, read by Justin Long.
Fascinating.
I didn't know. Yeah, I don't know. The more I learn about this, the more I see how often they tag just actors to do this. And I mean, some actors I think are really good at it and some are not built to these things. I'm really interested in how Justin Long pulls this off, because I wouldn't think of him as audiobook reader guy.
You know, what I think I'm coming to understand is that actors are actually good at a lot of things that we don't give them credit for.
That's true. That is true.
Like, I never would have thought that William Hurt could do, not could do, that seems more, because like I know he's a good actor, but like the way he does the scenes with the low men where he's kind of going big, and William Hurt doesn't usually go big, you know, but he knows that it's called for, so he does.
Sure. Well, the thing I learned, Bronson Pinchot was on the Kingcast last week, who you will remember from the Langoliers as our amazing paper ripping guy, but also Balky from Perfect Strangers. Apparently, he's been doing audiobooks for years. He's done so many. It's like his main thing now, kind of, that he does audiobooks. And so apparently he's incredible at it. He's done a few Stephen King. So I didn't know that. Really want to hear Balky read some Stephen King to me now.
All right. That sounds very, very fun. He's a fixture of my childhood.
Mm-hmm. I don't know if anyone younger than us understands. So I put on Perfect Strangers for my sister, my wife and her sisters. And they were just like completely flabbergasted by what the fuck is going on with this whole thing. And no one understands why we loved that show so much, but I watched every episode of that show.
Uh-huh. Yeah. It's impossible to explain the early 90s childhood phenomenon.
Side note, I don't know if it's a good show. I think it's actually a bad show, but I love it.
This is a slight tangent. Actually, this is a major tangent, but it shouldn't last long.
That's what we do, man. We got some bad reviews that say we go on too many tangents, and you know what? That just makes me want to go on more.
Yeah. All right. So here it is. So on some recent week, we talked about like stuff that actually made us scared. It might have been on the Doofcast, actually.
Yes.
Like movies that actually made us scared when we were kids. And I remembered something that I left off my list because it was not a movie. It was TV, which was The X-Files. The X-Files fucked me up way more than any other thing ever. And I didn't think of it when we were having that conversation because I was specifically thinking about movies. But the Fluke Man episode and the Stretchy Man episode, night fucking like terror, literal nightmare, staying awake in my bed, looking at the vent on my wall, just worried that something was going to come crawling out of it. Really, in fact, when I realized that, I totally had to like reconsider what I had said in that conversation, because in the conversation, it makes me seem like I was just never scared as a child. And it's like, no, I was just leaving out all the X-Files terror. Anyway, massive tangent. But
yeah, I kept waiting for you to go back to Bronson Pinchot with that. And I was like, no, we're not even, that's a big tangent. I love it. It
was related in my head somehow. I think it was related to the idea of Langoliers, actually.
Sure. I thought, I was waiting for you to tell me that the Langoliers scared the shit out of you.
I'm not obligated to make things make sense.
That's fine. We had one more comment we had from listener Jennifer D that really didn't fit into any category, but I wanted to talk about it. Anyway, they say, I read Hearts in Atlantis when it was released 20 odd years ago before I read Dark Tower. It ended up being a kind of throwaway book for me. I had forgotten pretty much all about it. Rereading it now as a Tower junkie, I absolutely fell in love with it and was heartbroken each week when I had to stop reading to keep following along with you. Since finishing Loman, I've been devouring the subsequent stories and loving them too. So there you go, Matt. There's someone else that's going to be reading the rest of Hearts in Atlantis with you.
Awesome. That's so awesome. Awesome to hear that we were able to show people what was great about this story. And, I can kind of imagine that if I hadn't had to slow down and talk about it, I might not have kind of seen how beautiful the story was. So That's easy for me to believe.
Yeah. Jennifer wraps up her comment saying, I spent 3 days in Bangor, Maine this week. The reason for the getaway? The Stephen King tours of Maine trip through Derry. You guys and all of your listeners should put this tour on your bucket list. I watched the entire story of it unfold around me, along with gems from other stories. You know what, Matt? This is why I actually included this, because I'm going to make a bold and specific statement right now.
Okay.
When we finish with season 2, you and me, we're gonna go to Bangor and we're gonna do this tour. That's gonna be our we made it through 2 seasons of the show, and we're gonna go to our new Mecca.
That's a fucking great idea, actually. Yeah, let's do it.
So we'll talk about that in more detail, but we are committing ourselves to doing that right here, right now.
Awesome!
Boom.
I'm so excited, man. You've made me so excited now.
Good. I have no idea when that's going to be. I forget when we're actually going to be done with the stand. But sometime next year.
All right.
I was trying to buy time as I looked up our schedule. So we're supposed to complete the stand at the end of October. I don't know if we want to visit Maine in November.
Yeah, we'll hammer out those details.
We'll figure it out. But we're doing it, folks. We're doing it.
We are.
Okay, cool. So one last thing, Matt, before we go, I just wanted to talk to you about our next book. Everything's Eventual is the next story we're going to be reading. It is a short story. It is 50 pages long, so we are only doing it as one episode. And I'm wondering if you have any predictions or any idea about why we're reading this thing, what it's about, anything. You got anything?
No, I don't know anything about this one. I don't know what the connection is. I don't know if it's a character from the Dark Tower. I don't know if somebody just offhand says the word, gunslinger, and that's the connection. I have the least idea of any of the things that we have covered.
That's fun. I'm not going to tell you. You're going to discover it as you're reading.
Excellent.
This short story.
I don't even know if there's anything supernatural in it. Like that's one question that I almost asked but held back from. Is I was going to ask, is there anything supernatural in the other stories of Hearts in Atlantis? And then I was like, no, I'll find out. And I'll find it just as I'll find out with this one. So can't wait to find out.
Yeah, man. The Hearts in Atlantis. No, I'm not even going to say it. I don't want to spoil anything. I want you to enjoy Hearts in Atlantis. And I, of course, cannot wait to talk to you about Everything's Eventual, which will be our book for next week. We're just going to a one and done. We're just going to do the short story. And then we're going to move on to, what are we moving on to again? I just had the thing open. The Eyes of the Dragon. Oh, that's going to
Awesome.
be, oh man, we got some fun stuff coming up, man. The rest of season 2 is going to be great.
Can't wait.
I'm so excited. And then we're going to Maine in December.
Yep.
So yeah, short episode this week, but that's all we had for you folks. Thank you so much for all your submissions and for helping us kind of get our head around what we wanted this overview episode to be. It is always a little weird when short book and not a lot to talk about in this episode, but hey, we did it, Matt. We talked for almost an hour and a half.
Awesome.
So next week, again, we will be reading and discussing the entirety of Everything's Eventual, the Justin Long read short story, which is part of the 14 short story collection, also titled Everything's Eventual. This is the one that Little Sisters of Eloria was in. So if you've bought that collection when we read the Little Sisters of Eloria for Dark Tower, you should already have it. So just open that bad boy up and find Everything's Eventual.
I was wondering why it was already in my Audible library.
Well, there you go. That was why.
Perfect. Cool. Remember, you can reach out to us via email at kingslingerspod@gmail.com or on Twitter at kingslingerspod. And of course, the subreddit at r/doofmedia is a great place to hang out and answer discussion questions. That's where most people do it, to be honest.
Yep.
So we'll see you around.
And if you are not already subscribed to Kingslingers, we strongly recommend you do so you don't miss any of the fun bonus stuff we do occasionally with very little announcement. We just kind of drop it like the Do the King Thing contest this week. So please subscribe.
Yeah, and if you like any of our shows and you want to support us, then please consider donating to our Patreon account at patreon.com/doofmedia. Special thanks this week to new patrons William G, Hannah S, Gabriel K, and Juby Doo. Welcome. And we hope you enjoy the cool stuff that we have over there on the Patreon.
And of course, if you cannot afford to donate, that is absolutely okay. Still tons of ways to help us out. As always, sharing this podcast everywhere you can really, really helps, as does writing a review on Apple Podcasts. This week's Spotlight review comes from J. Cornelius Fox, who gives us 5 stars. And frankly, I give J. Cornelius Fox's name 5 stars because that's fucking great.
Hell yeah.
But J. Cornelius Fox says, great companion on the road to the tower. I found Kingslingers on my last journey to the Dark Tower, and man, am I glad I did. I've journeyed to the tower several times over the years, but always alone. It's better to travel with companions, and you couldn't ask for a better quartet than Old Hand and Constant Reader Scott and King Newbie Matt. Their conversations and insights have expanded my love for the series in a way I didn't know was possible. Season 2 featuring the other Dark Tower-related stories has also been downright delightful. Keep up the good work, fellas, and I'll catch you on the trail the next time I head back to the tower. Check out their other podcasts on Doof Media because there's probably more you'll enjoy. Yes, thank you, Jay, for reminding us to tell other people about our other podcasts, which we always forget to do. Check out the Doofcast. We're doing a series on James Cameron right now, and we just talked about one of my favorite movies of all time, Titanic, last week, which was great.
It's been great revisiting our childhoods with Terminator 2 and Titanic and Aliens and just all that good stuff.
It has indeed. But that's going to do it for us this week. We will see you folks right back here next week for Everything's Eventual. Long days and pleasant nights.
And may you have twice the number.